The lamp burned steady in the window as Eleanor spoke her vows. Late autumn light filtered through the cabin's single glass pane, touching worn pine floors and mended curtains with gold. The traveling preacher's voice filled the small room while Thomas Brennan stood beside her, calloused hands folded, watching her face with an intensity she couldn't quite name. "Do you take this woman to be your lawful wedded wife?" "I do." His voice was quiet but firm. Eleanor glanced around what would become her home. In the salle de coucher, the furniture showed years of use, carefully maintained but humble. A pot-bellied stove radiated warmth. Shelves held simple dishes and a few books. Everything spoke of honest poverty, of a man who worked with his hands and knew the value of what little he possessed. Benin. It comforted her more than any grand house ever could. She'd fled a world where suitors counted her father's acres before learning her name, where young men with soft hands and calculating eyes had courted wealth dressed in petticoats. Yakunade Bardina Stahar. 3 proposals in 2 years, each man unable to describe the color of her eyes but perfectly aware of her inheritance. Thomas was different. He'd approached her at the church social with dirt under his fingernails and kindness in his weathered face. Dan. He'd asked about her thoughts on the sermon, not her father's holdings. When he'd proposed a month later, he'd offered only himself and his young daughter, speaking plainly of the simple life they'd share. "You may kiss your bride," i.e. Thomas's kiss was gentle, respectful. When he pulled back, something flickered in his eyes. Relief, perhaps. Or was it pain? Eleanor couldn't tell. Before she could consider it further, a small voice broke the moment. "Oh, Papa." His daughter stood in the corner, clutching a rag doll to her chest. The child was 7, thin as a willow branch. With her father's dark eyes, she'd barely spoken during the brief courtship, watching Eleanor with careful wariness. Eleanor crossed the room and knelt to the girl's level. The worn floorboards pressed into her knees through her wedding dress. "Hello? Sarah? We're going to be a family now. Would that be all right with you?" The girl studied her face for a long moment. Something in Eleanor's expression must have satisfied her because she gave the smallest of nods. "I'd like that," Sarah whispered. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. She opened her arms, and after a heartbeat's hesitation, the child stepped into them. The rag doll pressed between them, and Eleanor could feel Sarah's heart beating like a trapped bird. Over the child's head, she met Thomas's gaze. He stood motionless in the doorway, backlit by autumn sun, his expression unreadable. His jaw worked as though he wanted to speak, but no words came. The preacher cleared his throat and gathered his Bible. "Well then, I'll leave you folks to your new life. May God bless this union." After he left, Eleanor unpacked her small trunk while Thomas tended the evening fire. She'd brought little, needing little. A few dresses, her mother's silver brush, 3 books. As she arranged them on a shelf, she noticed through the window that Thomas had stepped outside. He stood alone in the gathering dusk, staring toward the dark mountains that rose beyond the cabin. His shoulders were rigid, his hands clenched at his sides. When Eleanor opened the door to call him for supper, he turned with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Coming," he said. But she'd seen something in his posture, in the way he'd been staring at those distant peaks. Something hidden, something heavy. She told herself it was only the strangeness of the day, the weight of new promises. Every man felt the responsibility of a wife and child. That was all it was. Behind her, the lamp burned steady in the window. Its warm light reached into the darkness, but couldn't quite touch the shadows gathering in the distant hills. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that felt like coming home. Eleanor woke before dawn to tend the kitchen garden. harvesting the last carrots and turnips before the hard frost came. Thomas split wood in the yard, the steady thunk of his axe marking the morning hours. Sarah followed Eleanor everywhere, learning to knead bread and mend torn hems. "You're a natural at this," Eleanor said one afternoon, watching Sarah's careful stitches. "Your hands know what to do." Sarah ducked her head, pleased. "Mama used to sew before she got sick." It was the first time the child had mentioned her mother. Eleanor's hands stilled on her own mending. She waited, letting Sarah choose whether to say more. "I miss her," Sarah said softly, "but I'm glad Papa found you." Eleanor pulled the girl close. Through the window, she could see Thomas at the fence line, hammer in hand. He looked up as though feeling their gaze, and something passed across his face too quickly to name. Sunday brought neighbors. The Carters arrived on horseback, bringing a venison roast and loud laughter. Talk turned, as it often did, to the wealthy ranchers in the valley. "Did you hear about Morrison's new house?" Mrs. Carter said, her voice thick with disapproval. 3 stories, they say, with painted wallpaper from San Francisco. All that money and not a lick of sense about what matters." Eleanor laughed. "Why, Edie, I'm grateful to be free from such pretentious circles. I'd choose an honest man over a rich fool any day. Give me a good heart over a full purse. That's what I say." The words came easy and true. She meant them with her whole being. Thomas went utterly still. His coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth, color draining from his face. "Excuse me," he said abruptly. "Standing. Need to check on the horses." He left the cabin in 3 strides. Through the window, Eleanor watched him lean against the barn wall, head bowed, shoulders shaking. Was he ill? She started to rise, but Mrs. Carter distracted her with a question about preserving beans. That night, after the neighbors left, Eleanor found Thomas in the barn. He stood in the shadows beyond the lantern light, staring at nothing. "Are you well?" she asked. He straightened quickly. "Just tired. Long day." "Thomas, if something's troubling you—" "Nothing's troubling me." His voice was sharper than he'd ever used with her, then softer. "I'm sorry. I'm just grateful. That's all. Grateful you chose me." He kissed her forehead and returned to the cabin, leaving Eleanor alone with the horses and her confusion. Inside, Sarah was humming as she prepared for bed. The sound stopped Eleanor in her tracks. The child hadn't made music since Eleanor had met her. Thomas had said, not since her mother died. Now she hummed a simple tune, brushing her doll's yarn hair, and the sound was like spring water over stone. Eleanor joined her, and together they sang a lullaby Eleanor's own mother had taught her. Sarah's voice was tentative but true. When Thomas appeared in the doorway to listen, Eleanor saw his eyes glistening. In the lamplight, "My girls," he whispered. Later, as Eleanor drifted towards sleep, she heard Thomas rise. Through half-closed eyes, she watched him stand at the window, looking out at the night. His shoulders were rigid again, his hands pressed flat against the glass. "She loves us," he whispered to the darkness. "That's what matters." But his hands were shaking, and Eleanor didn't understand why. The old ranch hand arrived on a Tuesday morning, riding a bay mare that had seen better years. Eleanor was hanging wash when she heard Thomas greet him. "Jed, what brings you up here?" "Just checking the stock on the South Range." The old man's eyes swept the cabin, the neat garden, Eleanor at the clothesline. "Heard you took a wife. Wanted to see for myself." This is Eleanor, Thomas said. His voice carried an edge of warning. Eleanor, this is Jed. He works the Morrison spread. Eleanor came forward, wiping her hands on her apron. Pleased to meet you. Jed touched his hat brim. Ma'am, must be quite a change for you. Living up here in this little place after... He trailed off at Thomas's sharp look. After what? Eleanor asked. Curious. After nothing, Thomas said quickly. Jed, I'll walk you to your horse. But Jed was already talking. Just seems a shame. The old Brennan place standing empty all this time. 2 years now since the tragedy. That big house just gathering dust while you hide out here. That's enough. Thomas's voice could have cut steel. Jed looked between them, understanding dawning. Oh. She doesn't... You haven't told her about... There's nothing to tell. ABD. Thomas gripped the old man's arm and steered him toward his horse. You should be getting back. Eleanor watched them confer in low voices by the barn. Jed kept shaking his head, looking troubled. Finally he mounted and rode off, glancing back once with something like pity in his eyes. Thomas returned slowly, not meeting Eleanor's gaze. The Brennan place, she asked. Old man's confused. Talks nonsense half the time. But Eleanor knew evasion when she heard it. She let it pass, though the question lodged in her mind like a splinter. That afternoon, while Sarah napped and Eleanor kneaded bread, Thomas sat on the porch, mending fence wire. She could see him through the open door, his hands working automatically while his thoughts traveled far away. He was remembering, though she couldn't know it, remembering Margaret dying in their bed at the mansion, the consumption taking her by inches while doctors came and went and collected their fees, remembering the relatives who'd barely visited when she was well suddenly appearing, making inquiries about the estate, about provisions for young Sarah, remembering social acquaintances who'd filled their parlor when the house gleamed with wealth and emptied. At the moment grief made him poor company. The parties he'd hosted, the business connections he'd made, all of it hollow, all of it meaningless, when the woman he loved breathed her last, in a house too big to hold their sorrow. He'd fled to this forgotten line shack on the eastern edge of his property, fled with Sarah in a determination to find something real, someone who'd love them for themselves, not for the Brennan name or the Brennan fortune. Eleanor had been his answer. Sweet, genuine Eleanor who'd embraced their simple life with joy, who'd laughed at the idea of wealth, who'd said she'd choose an honest man over a rich fool. The wire snapped in his hands. He'd pulled it too tight. He looked toward the mountains where his family's estate sprawled across 300 acres. Chuck's, the house he'd built for Margaret, now empty. The wealth he'd earned through sweat and risk, now meaningless. He'd tested Eleanor and found her true, but the test had become a trap. How could he tell her now? How could he explain that he'd lied every day for months? That the humble ranch hand she'd married was actually one of the wealthiest men in the territory she'd leave. Insan made say. She'd see it as the ultimate betrayal, and he'd be alone again. This time with the knowledge that he'd destroyed something precious with his own deception. Inside, Eleanor called Sarah to help with supper. The girl's laughter rang clear. Through the window, Thomas watched his wife and daughter working side by side, their heads bent together over a pot of stew. I can't tell her, he whispered to the empty porch. I can't lose them. He was trapped by his own design. The lie too large now to confess. The truth too sharp to bear. That evening, as Eleanor read to Sarah by lamplight, the child looked up at her new mother with complete trust. I'm glad Papa found you. I prayed for someone good, and God sent you. Thomas. Listening from his chair, felt the words like stones on his chest. His daughter's faith. His wife's trust, both built on sand. He couldn't meet Eleanor's eyes when she smiled at him across the room. Et det daisa. Winter settled over the land like a held breath. Snow came in early December, blanketing the world in silence. Thomas cut wood until his shoulders ached, stacking cords against the cabin wall. Eleanor rendered tallow and made soap, preserving the last autumn apples in jars that lined the pantry shelves. Sarah bloomed like a late rose. She chattered now where she'd been silent, sang where she'd been mute. Eleanor taught her letters by the fire, while Thomas carved her a set of wooden animals. The child arranged them in elaborate farms and villages, narrating stories in a voice that grew stronger each day. The mama horse takes care of the baby horse, Sarah explained one evening, moving the carved figures. Because that's what mamas do. They stay. Eleanor's throat tightened. She pulled the girl close, meeting Thomas's eyes across the room. In that moment, the three of them were complete. A family forged not by blood alone, but by choice and care. If only Thomas could shake the weight that pressed against his ribs with every easy moment, every honest smile. The Holcomb family lived 5 miles south, scratching out an existence on thin soil and thinner luck. They appeared one Sunday afternoon, arriving in a wagon that listed to one side. The father, Jacob, was thin as whipcord. His wife, Emma, carried a baby on her hip, while 3 other children huddled in the wagon bed, their coats too small, their faces pinched with cold. "Hi, Steve. Heard there was new folks up here," Jacob said, his pride barely covering desperation. "Thought we'd pay respects." Eleanor took one look at those children and flew into action. Within minutes, she'd set out every scrap of food in the cabin: bread, butter, dried apples. Venison stew reheated on the stove. She poured milk for the children and pressed Emma to take second helpings. "You're too generous," Emma protested. But her eyes were grateful. "Nonsense. That's what neighbors do." The children ate like they couldn't remember their last full meal. Sarah shared her wooden animals, showing the youngest boy how to make the horse gallop. The cabin rang with voices and laughter, but Eleanor noticed details that troubled her. The persistent cough rattling in the middle child's chest, the baby's listless crying, the way Emma swayed with exhaustion. "If you ever need anything," Eleanor said as they prepared to leave, "please don't hesitate. We may not have much, but we share what we can." Jacob nodded, too proud to say the help was already needed. Thomas helped him straighten the wagon's load, pressing a portion of dried venison into his hands. "For the children," he said quietly. After they left, Eleanor stood at the window watching their wagon disappear into the snowy dusk. If only we had more room, more resources. We could help them properly. Thomas said nothing. He stood behind her, his reflection ghostly in the window glass, his jaw working. Roz. That night he couldn't sleep. He rose and stood outside in the bitter cold, looking south where the Holcomb's cabin hunched in poverty. Then turning to stare at the dark mountains where his mansion sprawled empty and useless. He had 15 rooms standing vacant, pantries full of preserved goods, medical supplies, money enough to help a dozen families, and he was keeping it all locked away because he was afraid of losing a woman who'd proven her heart 100 times over. The shame of it burned hotter than the cold. January brought deep cold and long nights. The world narrowed to the cabin's warm circle. The 3 of them bound together by firelight and shared purpose. Eleanor had never known such contentment, such simple completeness. One evening, after Sarah had gone to bed, Eleanor sat beside Thomas at the hearth. She'd been quiet all day, thoughtful, Now she reached for his hand. I need to tell you something about my past, she said, about why I'm so grateful for this life. Thomas tensed, but nodded for her to continue. When I turned 18, my father started introducing me to what he called suitable young men. They were suitable in only one way. They wanted his land, his connections, his money. Not one of them could tell you my favorite color, or the books I loved, or what made me laugh. Her voice remained steady, but Thomas heard the old hurt in it. Robert Chandler proposed first. He'd never asked me a single question about myself, but he knew to the acre how much property my father owned. Then James Sullivan, who discussed the marriage settlement with my father before he ever spoke to me. Then William Price, who actually told me I'd be fortunate to marry so well. He turned to face Thomas fully. Do you know what that feels like, to know you're valued as an acquisition? Not a person. To wonder if anyone will ever see you instead of what you bring. Eleanor, let me finish. When you proposed, you offered only yourself and Sarah. You didn't ask about my inheritance or my father's holdings. You talked about building a life together, about partnership. You saw me. Her eyes shone with tears. I'm grateful you're just a ranch hand. Thomas, I thank God every day that you're unburdened by wealth. It means what we have is real. The words landed like blows, each one true, each one damning. Thomas felt his throat close. He opened his mouth to confess, to tell her everything, but fear seized him by the neck. What if she left? What if she saw his test as the ultimate manipulation? What if, Thomas, what's wrong? He'd been silent too long. She was watching him with concern, her hand still warm in his. Nothing. I'm just, moved by what you've said. The lie tasted like ash. You honor me with your trust. Even as he said it, he felt the dishonor of his deception. Eleanor smiled and leaned against his shoulder. We're going to have a good life. Aren't we simple and honest and real? Yes, he whispered. We are. After she slept, Thomas dressed and went outside. The stars burned cold and distant overhead. He stood in the yard between the cabin and the dark mountains, caught between the life he'd built on lies and the truth that would destroy it. The lamp burned in the cabin window behind him, warm, welcoming, everything he'd wanted. But he stood outside it now, separated by his own deception. He could see Eleanor's silhouette as she moved past the window, checking on Sarah before bed. She trusted him completely. That was the knife that cut deepest. She loves us, he told the frozen night. She loves us truly. But his voice broke on the words, because he knew the cost of keeping her love was becoming unbearable. And still he said nothing. Still he chose the comfortable lie over the hard truth. Still he told himself it was to protect them, when he knew he was only protecting himself from the pain of losing them. The lamp burned on in the window. Thomas stood in darkness, unable to step back into that warm light, unable to walk away from it. Trapped by his own design, the message came on a bitter Tuesday morning. A boy rode up from the South Range, his horse steaming in the cold. The Holcombs! He gasped. They're sick, all of them. Mrs. Holcomb sent me to fetch help. Eleanor was moving before the boy finished speaking. She gathered blankets, medicinal herbs, preserved broth. Thomas, hitch the wagon. We need to go now. Ainon bidra. Thomas helped her load supplies, his mind racing ahead to the problem he could no longer avoid. They found the Holcomb cabin in chaos. Jacob was bedridden with fever, His face flushed and eyes glazed. Emma struggled to care for 4 sick children while fighting her own fever. Baden cry. The baby's cry was weak and reedy. The smell of illness hung heavy in the close air. Eleanor rolled up her sleeves immediately. She bathed fevered foreheads, spooned broth into unwilling mouths, changed soiled bedding. Thomas carried water and split wood for their failing fire. For 3 hours they worked, bringing what order they could to the crisis. Finally, Eleanor pulled Thomas outside. Her face was drawn with worry. They need constant care, all of them. This fever could turn to pneumonia. She looked at their tiny cabin in the distance. We should bring them to our place. But Thomas, we don't have room. 6 people and the 3 of us. We can't possibly fit. Thomas felt the trap closing. We could manage somehow. Where would we put them? They need separate spaces. Clean air. Room to recover. Our cabin barely holds the 3 of us. Frustration edged her voice. If only we had more space. A larger house. But we don't. And they're going to suffer because we can't help properly. Thomas closed his eyes. The moment had arrived. The crisis he dreaded. The choice he couldn't avoid. Help them. And reveal the truth. Or keep his secret and let neighbors suffer. There must be something we can do. Eleanor insisted. We can't abandon them. Thomas, we can't. He looked at his wife. At the fierce compassion in her face, the determination to serve others regardless of cost. This was who she truly was, generous, selfless, good. Everything he'd hoped to find, and he'd lied to her every day for months. I have space, he said quietly. Eleanor blinked. What? We have space. More than enough space. His heart hammered against his ribs. There's somewhere else we can take them. I don't understand. What are you talking about? Thomas took a breath that felt like drowning. Get your coat. I need to show you something. Show me what, Thomas? We don't have time for that. Please. His voice cracked. Just trust me. One more time. Please trust me. Something in his face stopped her arguments. She stared at him. Confusion giving way to unease. You're frightening me. I know. I'm sorry, but we can help them. Eleanor, I promise we can help them. Just come with me. They returned to their cabin long enough to leave Sarah with a neighbor, explaining only that there was an emergency. Then Thomas helped Eleanor into their wagon and turned the horses not south toward home, but east toward the mountains. Where are we going? Eleanor asked. You'll see. Thomas, this doesn't make sense. What space are you talking about? He didn't answer. Couldn't answer. Every word felt like stepping off a cliff. The wagon climbed a path Eleanor had never seen. Though she'd lived here for months, the trail was overgrown but passable, winding up through winter-bare aspens toward the mountain's shoulder. I've never been this way. Eleanor said, Why haven't we? She stopped. Through the trees ahead, something was appearing. Something massive and impossible. A mansion rose from the mountainside like a stone ship breaching waves. 3 stories of native rock and timber, with wide porches and tall windows, commanding a view of the entire valley. Smoke hadn't risen from its chimneys in years. Snow lay undisturbed on its eaves, but it was magnificent, expensive, grand. Eleanor's face went white. No, she whispered. Thomas pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the mansion's main entrance. Eleanor sat frozen, staring at the building as though it might vanish if she looked away. Oh gosh, whose property is this? Her voice was barely audible. Thomas climbed down and came around to help her. She didn't take his hand. He let his arm fall, defeated. "It's mine," he said quietly. "Ours. It's been mine for 15 years. My family built it 30 years ago." "No," she shook her head, still not looking at him. "That's not possible. You're a ranch hand. You work for Morrison." I am Morrison. I mean, I own the Morrison spread. All of it. 300 acres. This house. Everything." Now she turned to face him. Tears streaked her cheeks. Her eyes wide with betrayal. "You lied to me." "Yes. For months, every single day. You lied." "Yes. Why?" The word was a wounded sound. Why would you do this?" Thomas felt his own tears coming. "Please, come inside. Let me explain. I owe you that much." Eleanor looked like she might refuse, might demand he take her away from this place, this lie made of stone and timber, but slowly, moving as though in a nightmare. She let him help her down. The mansion's front door was unlocked. Thomas pushed it open, and the smell of abandonment rolled out dust and cold and emptiness. Their footsteps echoed on marble floors as they entered. Eleanor turned slowly in the grand foyer. A curved staircase swept upward. Paintings hung on walls draped with cloth. Furniture stood shrouded like ghosts. Every surface filmed with dust. Every corner holding shadows. Thomas lit a lamp in the main parlor. The light illuminated a room that should have been magnificent high ceilings, stone fireplace, windows facing the valley but felt only hollow. The warmth of their cabin's single lamp seemed 1,000 miles away. "Sit down," Thomas said softly. "Please." Eleanor perched on the edge of a cloth-covered chair. She wouldn't look at him. Thomas knelt before her. "My wife Margaret died in this house 2 years ago. Consumption. It took her slowly. Over 6 months. Every room here holds a memory of watching her suffer." Eleanor's anger flickered but held. "That doesn't excuse—" "No, it doesn't. Nothing excuses it. But I need you to understand." He drew a shaking breath. "When Margaret was dying, people came. Relatives who'd barely visited when she was well suddenly appeared, asking about the estate, about provisions for Sarah, about who'd inherit what. Friends who'd filled this house during good times disappeared the moment grief made me difficult company. He gestured to the shrouded furniture. "We hosted parties here. Business dinners, social gatherings. I thought we were building a life, making connections. But when Margaret died, I realized none of it was real. They didn't care about me or my daughter. They cared about this." His hand swept the empty room. "The money, the property, the Brennan name." And Eleanor's face was stone. "I couldn't stay here. Every corner reminded me of watching her die. Every room echoed with false sympathy and calculating questions. So I fled to the old line shack with Sarah, determined to find something authentic, someone real." Now he met her eyes. "When I met you, I knew. I felt it immediately, but I'd been fooled before. Eleanor. I'd believed social climbers were friends, that wealth and love were the same thing. So I tested you. I presented myself as a simple ranch hand to see if you'd love me anyway. And I did. I quis so, though soy." Eleanor's voice was flat. "I loved you. I loved Sarah. I chose you precisely because you weren't wealthy. because I thought what we had was honest. She stood abruptly. But it was another lie. Another man valuing me as a test subject instead of a person. That's not, isn't it? Her voice rose. You tested me. Thomas. Like Robert Chandler tested whether I'd be an obedient wife. Like James Sullivan tested whether I'd accept his terms. You're no different. You just used poverty instead of wealth to see if I'd pass your examination. The truth of it hit him like a fist. You're right. God forgive me. You're right. As he wait. Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself. I told you about being valued as an acquisition, about wondering if anyone would ever see me. And all along, you were doing the same thing, measuring my worth, determining if I met your standards. I'm sorry. Thomas's voice broke. Eleanor, I'm so deeply sorry. I was afraid of being alone again. Of Sarah. Growing up surrounded by people who wanted our money instead of loving us. But you're right. I deceived you. I hurt you. I chose fear over trust. They stood in the cold parlor, the lamp casting their shadows long across dust-covered floors. Finally, Eleanor spoke. This house nearly destroyed you. Didn't it? Wealth without love is just a beautiful prison. Thomas nodded, unable to speak. Eleanor looked around at the empty grandeur. The Holcombs need help. They need space, medical care, warmth. You have all of that here, standing empty while you hide from your own ghosts. Yes, She met his eyes at last. Then let's use it. Let's fill these empty rooms with something real, with purpose instead of pretense. Thomas felt his knees weaken. You're saying, I'm saying I'm hurt, deeply hurt, and it will take time for me to trust you again. Her voice hardened. But those people are suffering, and we can help them. So that's what we're going to do. She moved toward the door, then paused. Tomorrow we bring the Holcombs here, together, as partners. And Thomas? She turned back, her face stern. No more secrets. Ever, if we're going to make this work. We build it on truth from now on. I promise? Good. Her shoulders softened slightly. Now take me home. We have work to do. As they descended the mountain in darkness, the mansion stood behind them with its windows dark. But tomorrow, Thomas thought, tomorrow there would be light in those windows again. Tomorrow they'd fill the emptiness with purpose. Together, they brought the Holcombs at first light. Jacob and Emma in the wagon bed. Too weak to protest. The children huddled in blankets, their fevers burning hot. Sarah rode along, wide-eyed at her old home emerging from morning mist. Thomas had risen before dawn to build fires in 3 rooms, to air out bedding, to make the east wing as welcoming as he could. Now he and Eleanor worked side by side, settling the sick family into spaces that hadn't held life in 2 years. Jacob was installed in a bedroom with windows facing south light to lift spirits. Emma and the baby took a connecting room where Eleanor could tend them through the night. The 3 older children shared a third room, Sarah helping arrange their few possessions with careful generosity. Ike, this house is magic, the youngest Holcomb boy whispered, touching papered walls with wondering fingers. Eleanor moved through the work with determined efficiency. She didn't avoid Thomas, but she didn't seek him out either. They communicated in necessary sentences about practical matters, where to store the medicine, how often to change the bedding, who would take which watch through the night. It was a partnership built on immediate need, and Thomas was grateful even for that. By nightfall, the house that had stood empty for 2 years breathed again. Fires glowed in hearths, lamps burned in windows, the sounds of life coughing. Yes, but also soft conversation, a child's whispered question. The clink of spoons in soup bowls filled rooms that had known only silence. Thomas found Eleanor on the wide porch as the sun set over the valley. She stood with her arms wrapped around herself, looking out at mountains going purple with dusk. "They're resting," he said quietly. "All of them." She nodded but didn't speak. Thomas moved to stand beside her, careful to leave space between them. "I want to talk about trust, about building it back. If that's even possible." "It's possible." Eleanor's voice was tired. "But Thomas, trust isn't given. It's earned, and you broke mine completely." "I know. Do you understand what it felt like? Standing in front of that house. Everything I'd believed about you, about us, revealed as performance." She turned to face him. "I thought I'd finally found someone who saw me for who I am. But you were too busy testing me to actually see me at all." The words cut because they were true. "I was wrong." Thomas said simply, "There's no excuse that makes it right. I was afraid of being hurt again, so I hurt you first. I tested you when I should have trusted you. And I'm sorrier than I know how to say." Eleanor studied his face in the fading light. "What happens now? Do we stay in the cabin and pretend this place doesn't exist? Do we live here and pretend the last months weren't a lie? How do we move forward?" "I don't know," Thomas admitted. But I know I don't want to lose you. Either of you. You won't lose Sarah. That child loves you absolutely." Eleanor's voice softened slightly. "And you won't lose me either, because despite everything, I still love you. But love isn't enough. Thomas, we need honesty, we need partnership. We need to build something real." "Yes, we do." Yet they stood in silence as stars began appearing. Inside, someone coughed wetly, then quieted. The house held the sounds of need and care, of suffering being tended. Finally, Eleanor spoke again. "What will we do with this place after the Holcombs recover? I mean, will you go back to hiding here?" Thomas looked at the mansion behind them, then back at his wife. "What do you want to do?" "I asked you first. I want whatever makes us whole again." Thomas said. "Oh, whatever that looks like." Eleanor considered. "This house broke you because it was filled with false things. False friendships. False status. False value." She gestured to the lit windows. "But right now it's filled with real need and real care. It has purpose." "It does. What if we kept doing that?" Eleanor turned to face him fully. "What if instead of hiding from wealth or flaunting it, we used it opened rooms to families who needed shelter, hosted community gatherings, made this place mean something beyond just money and stone?" Thomas felt something loosen in his chest. "You'd want that to stay here, to turn it into something useful." "I don't know yet. Maybe, but I do know that hiding from resources doesn't make you humble. It just makes the resources useless." She smiled slightly. The first real smile she'd given him in days. "Wealth without love is a prison. But wealth used with love, that could be freedom." Thomas's vision blurred. You're extraordinary. No, I'm practical and hurt, and trying to figure out how to forgive you while still honoring that hurt. She paused. Forgiveness doesn't mean the pain disappears. Thomas, it means I'm choosing to move forward despite it. Waigastal sano. To build something new instead of guarding something broken. I'll spend the rest of my life earning back what I lost. Thomas said, Yes, you will. Adin. But her tone was softer now. Starting tomorrow, with honesty and partnership and no more secrets. No more secrets, he promised. They stood together watching the first star appear over the mountains. Behind them, the mansion glowed with lamplight from half a dozen windows. Tomorrow they'd continue the work of healing the Holcombs' bodies and their own fractured trust. But tonight, for the first time since the revelation, Eleanor let Thomas take her hand. It was a beginning. 10 days passed. The fevers broke slowly, one patient at a time. The oldest Holcomb boy recovered first, then the middle children. Jacob began sitting up, taking broth without assistance. Emma's color returned, and the baby's cry grew stronger. The mansion transformed. Dust disappeared from surfaces. Fires burned steady in cleaned hearths. Eleanor organized the vast kitchen, discovering pantries full of preserved goods that Sarah had been too young to reach, that Thomas had been too grief-stricken to remember. Wakey. They fed the recovering family good food and gave them rest. Thomas brought wood and tended the grounds. Sarah delighted in having playmates, teaching the Holcomb children games her mother had taught her years ago. And slowly, carefully, Thomas and Eleanor rebuilt what his deception had fractured. She let him help her in the kitchen, working side by side. They talked while they worked real conversation about hopes and fears, about the future they might build. Thomas told her about Margaret, about the good years before grief. Eleanor shared more about her lonely life among suitors who saw only inheritance. Yasar High. I was so certain I'd found honesty with you, she said one afternoon, kneading bread. And that's what hurt most, not the wealth, but the testing, being examined instead of trusted. I know. Iger Thomas measured flour beside her. And I can't undo it. I can only promise it won't happen again. Good. She covered the dough to rise. Because if we're going to do this, really do this, we need to start from truth. We will. By the second week, Jacob was walking the corridors. Emma was laughing again. The children had color in their cheeks and energy to spare. They'd recover completely. The danger passed. One evening, Eleanor found Jacob and Emma in the front parlor. They stood looking uncomfortable among the fine furnishings, clearly preparing to speak. We need to head home soon. Jacob said, We've imposed long enough. Can't thank you folks enough for the care, but we've got to get back to our own place. You're not imposing. Eleanor said, You're recovering. Emma clutched her shawl. Still, it don't feel right. Taking your hospitality when we can't repay it. Eleanor exchanged glances with Thomas, who'd appeared in the doorway. They'd discussed this. She spoke carefully. I schwai did die. What if you didn't have to repay it? What if we just helped? Because that's what neighbors do. Jacob shifted uncomfortably. That's kind. But a man has his pride. I understand a pride, Thomas said quietly. Bay. But there's another kind of pride, the kind that accepts help when it's offered and passes it forward when you're able. You do the same for us. We would, Emma said softly. We surely would. Then stay until you're truly well. Rest completely. And when you go home, go strong. Eleanor smiled. That's payment enough. After they left, Eleanor stood in the parlor looking at the room with new eyes. We should have more furniture brought down from storage. Make this warmer, more welcoming. You're planning to stay? Thomas asked carefully. Eleanor turned to him. I'm planning to use what we have. This place has resources, space, opportunity. It seems wasteful to abandon them when we could make them meaningful. What about the cabin? What about it? We could keep both. Stay at the cabin during busy seasons. Here when we're hosting people who need help. She moved to stand beside him. Unless you're still hiding from this place. I'm not. Thomas realized it was true. I'm not hiding anymore. You freed me from that. She took his hand. Not tentatively now, but firmly. Then let's build something worth having. Not a mansion, not a cabin, but a home. One based on truth and purpose and love. Yes, Thomas whispered. Yes. They found Sarah on the wide porch, watching the sunset with the Holcomb children. The mountain peaks glowed orange and gold, and the valley below darkened to purple shadow. Lamplight spilled from windows that hadn't known light in years. Sarah looked up as her parents joined them. Papa, are we going to stay here now? Thomas glanced at Eleanor. She nodded. Sometimes. Thomas said, we'll use both places. The cabin when we want quiet. This house when people need us. I like that. Sarah leaned against Eleanor's side. It looks like home now. Like a real home. Eleanor's arms came around the child. It is home. Finally. The youngest Holcomb boy pointed at the sky. Look, first star. They stood together watching as darkness gathered and stars emerged one by one. The mansion behind them glowed with warmth and purpose. The empty rooms that had held only grief now held healing. E nome das saten sexinadi. The wealth that had created isolation now fostered connection. Thomas felt Eleanor's hand in his, Sarah's weight against his side, and the presence of guests whose lives they'd helped save, filling the house with grateful life. This place was never a home until you made it one, he said softly. Both of you. Eleanor looked up at him. We made it together. With truth this time. With truth. He echoed. The first star brightened overhead. Ice was melting from the eaves, dripping in a slow rhythm that promised spring. Winter was ending. Inside and out. Thomas pulled his family close and looked out at the valley he'd once fled, the mountains he'd hidden in, the town that spread below holding neighbors they'd serve and strangers they'd welcome. It's chores. Everything lay ahead of them now, not the empty perfection he'd tried to build before, or the false simplicity he'd constructed to test Eleanor's heart, but something real and earned and true, a home built on honesty, a partnership forged through trial, a purpose that transformed wealth from burden into blessing. Sarah hummed softly, an old hymn. Eleanor joined her, their voices blending in the mountain air. And Thomas, no longer trapped by secrets or isolated by fear, added his voice to theirs. The lamp in the window burned steady, but now it was multiplied, a dozen windows glowing warm against the night, light reaching out to touch the darkness, inviting the lost and weary to come in from the cold. Home at last.